Welcome to the first panel discussion here at the Iowa City Public Library as part of the 2016 International Writing Program, our 49th annual session of this program. I am indebted to our colleagues here at the library who make this space available to us every Friday, as well as to Downing Thomas and International Programs, which provides the pizza in the back. For the audience watching at home, the writers' biographies and their samples of their work are available online, along with the full IWP fall residency schedule. That's at iwp.uiowa.edu. Today's panel is titled Right to Remove, Right to Refuge. Is changing one's country a basic human right? 4 of our writers will discuss this today, including the impact of millions in motion today worldwide. By way of introduction, I want to tell you about a dinner party I attended nearly a quarter of a century ago during the Wars of Succession in the former Yugoslavia. It happened that I watched the inauguration of President Bill Clinton in 1992 at the American Center in Skopje, Macedonia, and afterwards there was a dinner with various diplomats from the embassy, including a USAID official who at one point said, anybody involved in refugee work will have no problem finding a job for the next 30 years. He was off in his timing because of the way things have played out. It suggests that that timing will go on, that work situation will go on for some time to come. The setup for this panel is we invite you, each of our 4 writers will deliver a presentation which will eventually be loaded up online, and we invite you to write out questions on the index cards that have been passed around along with pencils. Kate and others will collect those questions and then we'll turn them over to the writers in the last minutes of the session. So our writers are Khaled ALKHAMISSI comes to us from Egypt. He is the founder and president of the Kena Storytelling Festival and the Mansoura Literary Festival. His 2007 collection, Taxi, Cabbie Talk, has been translated into 21 languages, including English. His novel, Noah's Ark, appeared in 2009 and was followed in 2014 by a nonfiction book, 2011. He is extensively involved in organizing public events to promote Arab and Egyptian literatures, cinemas, and culture. Sitting next to him, but not going second in order, second will be, I think we have, is it true we have Yaroslava going second?
No.
No. Okay. Second, 2 down. OLISAKWE, who comes to us from Nigeria. She writes TV scripts, most recently the series The Calabash, essays, short stories, and has 1 novel selected in 2014 by the Africa 39 Project as one of the continent's 39 most promising writers under the age of 40. She has had work appear in the New York Times and many other places. Next we will have, and sitting next to Khaled, Yaroslava PULINOVICH, who comes to us from Russia. She's an actress as well as a prolific playwright. Her plays are performed in Russia and abroad. The film adaptation of her play, I Won't Come Back, has received recognition at international film festivals in Rotterdam, Vlissingen, Moscow, and New York City. The Moscow Times named her play, Natasha's Dream, as one of the top 10 Russian plays of the 21st century. And finally, we have Alice YOUSEF, who comes to us from Palestine. She publishes poetry on her blog, Blooms in Indigo, writing on the Middle East, Palestinian experience, and the emotions of daily life. She's also published short stories and translations. She holds an MA in writing from the University of Warwick. Please join our distinguished writers for this panel.
Our earliest ancestors, it is said, all left Africa and headed north. Moses, it is said, left Egypt and headed east. Einstein left Europe and headed west. And the ancestor of Borges also abandoned Europe for South America. Even the camels that have come to be identified with the Arabian desert are believed to have actually originated in the coldest areas of North America. As far as the art of the novel, considered quintessentially European, one has only to read Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written around 1353, to ascertain the influence of Arabic narration techniques. None of this is new to us and only serves as a reminder that from the beginning of time, migration has often saved us from perishing of hunger and thirst, or at the hands of other equally pernicious forces. Whenever they go, humans have taken their creation with them. 7,000-year-old tombs discovered in Egypt revealed wares brought over from the Levant and from Ethiopia. 13 centuries before Jean de La Fontaine wrote his tales featuring pithy wisdom expressed by animals, some of those same stories have been told in the Hindu Kalila wa Dimna and could be found in ancient Egypt. As people and objects migrate, so do ideas. Our topic today is that of the immigration of citizens to more developed countries, one that is closely connected to the current hotly debated refugee crisis. I have written an entire novel, Noah's Ark, published in 2009, on the exodus of Egyptians in the recent past. But rather than spend this time doing what I most enjoy, telling you some of those stories, I prefer to discuss a few ideas related to today's topic. Nothing is more revealing of thought patterns than the terms coined and the language used to express them. A good starting place, therefore, would be some of the terminology commonly employed when discussing immigration. To cite some examples, illegal immigration, الهجرة غير الشرعية. This pejorative term, illegal, is closely tied to economically deprived individuals who risk their lives by braving the waters of the Mediterranean in fragile boats. Migration birds, الطيور المهاجرة. An older term more commonly used in reference to the educated middle classes, it evokes affection as well as giving the impression that the birds will return once their season of migration has come to an end. Brain drain migration, هجرة العقول. Arab politicians often refer to the danger of losing capable citizens to other countries, which go on to benefit from the skills that their own governments invested time and effort into developing. Hard currencies, العملة الصعبة. Countries like Egypt, Morocco, Syria, Iraq heavily rely on the remittances of their workers abroad as a source of hard currency, which is another way of referring to the dollar and euros, alluding to the difficulty of acquiring the currencies used to pay for imports. In Egypt's case, sources of hard currency are limited to the tourism industry, activities related to Suez Canal, and foreign remittances, which render the immigration of workers of vital necessity. And now, more to reflect on. First, the population issues. As the average age in developed countries rises and dips in those with less auspicious conditions, in 2015, for example, the average age in Germany was 46.5 years, while in Senegal it was 18.5 years. In Egypt, it's 22.5 years. And as the gap in living conditions continues to grow, new migration movements are expected to eclipse those heading towards the Americas in the 19th century. This is opposed to the rhetoric in receiving societies. In fact, the latter cannot survive without immigrants. And these some of the arguments I have recently heard being voiced in Arab countries. One of them told me one day, governments have failed to generate employment opportunities. Over 50% of young people in the 20 to 35 age group are unemployed. After having spent 10 years without a job, what is one expected to do? Another told me, futile death comes at us from all directions, from train accidents and those taking place on school expeditions, by droning from Nile barges, and under the effect of stray bullets carelessly shot by the police. How can we live in peace when we are constantly subjected to a futility that surpasses even Eugene Ionesco's? Another one told me, education is in contrast decline. How can we form families when we know we won't be able to educate our children? The only solution is to leave. A final thought. If migration has lasted as long as mankind, it is most unlikely to cease now. Governments may try to block the arrival of immigrants and to shut refugees out, but the movements of persons shall prevail. It is rather national boundaries and the concept of the nation state that will disappear. And I am sure of that. Thank you.
In August 2014, my parents packed their things and left Kano, in the city in northern Nigeria where I was born. A bomb had exploded the previous week, mere blocks from their home. My father often recounts how it all happened. He had just returned early from his shop, and my mother was preparing to go to church when the earth trembled and a sickening sound rent the air. The walls shook. They both ran out of their flat in fear. Loud cries filled the air. People ran in haphazard directions. Later, they would learn that a bomb had detonated at a car park nearby and left many people dead. For my father, it brought back the memories of surviving the bloody Nigerian Biafra War of 1967 to 70, an experience he rarely talked about. My father arrived in Kano almost a decade after the war because Kano was the new business frontier. He learned trading, married my mother, and had 5 children. Growing up, we had learned to navigate the uneasiness of the North. And after my siblings and I left home, my parents began a new enjoyable phase in their marriage. But the bomb explosion set an imbalance they weren't prepared for. A bomb blast was not the horror. It was a horror they did not know how to deal with. Boko Haram had become the new terror, spreading fear in Nigeria. In April 2014, the group, acting on its condemnation of westernization, kidnapped over 200 girls, many of whom still remain unaccounted for, and initiated a reign of terror that had left at least 8,000 people dead in Nigeria. My parents moved down to Onitsha in southeastern part of Nigeria. Starting all over again was like learning to use the left hand in old age. Difficult, but my father and my mother had a home to return to, and an opportunity many Nigerians are not lucky enough to have. As of December 2015, the IDP figure analysis conducted by the Internal Displaced Monitoring Center estimated that there are almost 2,152,000 internally displaced people in Nigeria, many of them originally from the northern part of the country, all of them displaced by Boko Haram attacks. My families are uprooted from their homes, children's education is cut short, and some are crammed into camps where they sleep in tents or in the open and cannot be absorbed fully into the system. With the global immigrant crisis, people who lose their homes are reduced to just terms, refugees. Their humanities stripped. They are talked about in hushes and accorded a distant sympathy that only arises when they make the news. Many of the internally displaced people in Nigeria are relocated to camps where diseases fester. Some families have left their designated camps and taken to the streets begging because they can no longer watch their children go hungry. They can no longer wait on government to fulfill promises. They can no longer hope. I agree that it is impossible to absorb the over 65 million people all over the world who have fled violence, who are now reduced to that term, refugees. But we can begin to see people as not just things. We can begin to see them as human beings, people whose lives were disrupted by wars not of their own making. There is a phrase in Igbo, my language, which came to mind when I was writing on this topic, one lady number, which is loosely translated to mean a brother in foreign lands. One lady number reminds us to show kindness, to give, and to shelter. One lady number teaches us how to restore faith in humanity. When my father arrived in Kano, clutching a bag, he was taken in by brothers, kindred spirits who gave him shelter. If my father did not find that hospitality as a stranger, he may never have met my mother, and I and my siblings may never have been. If we begin to look at the displaced more kindly, if we will begin to push for policies that restore hope, because we will begin to remember that they too have a life to live and a right to be. Thank you.
Khaled is going to read Yaroslava.
I asked to Khaled to help me because if I will do it, it will very slowly.
However, she's brilliant, so I really love your writing. Refugees. The right to relocate is an inalienable human right. The earth belongs to everyone. However, every right comes with obligations and responsibilities. People must decide whether to stay in their mother countries and make life better there, or give their strength to the prosperity of another country, a country they have chosen. In the latter situation, the laws of the country should become their laws. The word refugee is a political term, and granting asylum is a political act. What interests me, however, is a human element. How do people from different cultures get along with each other? Where do you find the strength to trust? How do you preserve your individuality without resorting to aggression? How do you assimilate different ways of life? As long as humanity persists, it will have to resolve these questions. As we know, one of the most complicated things of all is getting along with our neighbors. For my country, the 20th century was a century of immigration. People ran from Tsarist Russia, from Soviet Russia, from post-Soviet Russia, and they ran from the Russia of today. Currently, however, the issue of immigration to Russia, as well as international relations in general, has become equally pressing. People from the former Soviet republics, where the quality of life is lower, are streaming into Russia. Russian Soviet society has a very negative view of immigrants, and because of this, turned a blind eye to some of the action of its own citizens. As a nation, we are only beginning to learn how to coexist in new international relations. At the present time, millions of immigrants from the countries of the former Soviet Union, such as Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and others, live in Russia. As a rule, these are people without an education who possess few professional qualifications. Additionally, there are people who, for various economic or political reasons, were forced to leave their country. But these people frequently don't make a home in Russia either. Securing a job is very difficult for non-Russian citizens, and the jobs that people do find are often low-paying or entry-level work. Because of this influx of people from the former Soviet republics, however, there is a conviction among local populations in Russia that immigrants are taking their work because they are willing to do it for less money. This is honestly not true. In practice, Russians don't accept this sort of jobs, even if they are offered higher payment than immigrants. Additionally, many are bothered by the fact that immigrants very actively look for wives in Russia in order to stay in the country. Many Russian men feel threatened by this. People from Ukraine and Belarus, however, are expected from these views. Russians don't count them as migrants or other, and immigrants from these countries find work and assimilate much faster than people with Eastern roots. There is also issue of people migrating from the Russian Caucasus region, namely Dagestan and Chechnya. Chechnya, yes? Formally, these regions are part of Russia, and their inhabitants are Russian citizens. However, an overwhelming number of Russians consider the inhabitants of these regions hostile. They are, for them, others. The wars in these regions were not without repercussions, and it should be noted that ethnic Russians in Chechnya are not especially beloved either. The current liberal community is also convinced that, in the event of any social disturbances in Chechnya, the region will be supported by the Russian authorities because, at the present time, almost 100% of the population in the region supports the existing Chechen regional, pro-Moscow, government. I cannot verify this, but it seems to be true. In conclusion, I would like to say that, unfortunately, we are still in a deadlock. The government does very little to help immigrants assimilate into Russian culture, leading to aggression and alienations, which in turn leads to the citizens of Russia failing to understand immigrants. I hope that this situation is only temporary.
I'd like to open with a small quote from the poem Diary of a Palestinian Wound by our national poet Mahmoud Darwish. My country is not a suitcase. I am not a traveler. All I remember of him now are his deep gray blue eyes and his stories. Before he passed away, my grandfather was my hero. He lived in an old house in Jerusalem, one he built between the two wars that shaped his life and were a defining marker in his stories. He was not too fond of Jerusalem. Though it's one of the world's oldest, most religious, and most historic cities, it never suited him because he hoped that Jerusalem would be a temporary stop on his return to his mother city, Jaffa, known as Jaffa. It was 1948 when the cord with Jaffa was cut for good. My grandfather was 16. He lost everything. It was in the wake of what many Palestinians today call the Nakba, the catastrophe, referred to in historic jargon as the diaspora, where mass exodus or death awaited Palestinians. My grandfather was forced out of his city, and as luck and circumstances had it, found himself on a boat headed to Beirut, Lebanon. Luckier and happier than that of most refugees, my grandfather's life entailed a return to his home country, a marriage, a child, a line of grandchildren that starts with me. Not all refugees have that luck. I speak of luck as a saving grace because when faced with dangers resulting from war, nothing is guaranteed, not even a chance at life. In the past 2 years, the world has been witnessing alarming images of refugees risking their lives to cross borders by land and sea in order to start somewhere new. This constant movement is raising new questions and shaping various dynamics globally, unveiling many insecurities as well as paving grounds for violence, fear, and discrimination. New terms have surfaced in the media reflecting confusion about how to classify people like my grandfather who flee their countries in exchange for life. What rights are these refugees granted? How do we refer to them? And the main question, do we let the strangers in? The final answer to the latter question is dependent on many factors, including political and personal circumstances, such as success of making the cross. While I cannot begin to answer for others, I can safely say that through international conventions and treaties, namely the UN 1951 Refugee Status Convention, the answer is often a yes. Refugees should ideally be given a safe space to live. Staying in one country should not be a death sentence, nor should the option of starting life in another be. In simpler terms, when one is not happy with one's house, he or she moves. Similarly, when circumstances in one place threaten the livelihood of families and communities at large, sheltering these individuals and communities becomes crucial, even if practically it's not as simple as one would like to imagine. I've often read stories or novels based on the process of making the cross to the other side to begin a new life. Khaled Husseini's The Kite Runner helped me see how the threads between the old life and the new one come to be woven together for refugees and migrants. Despite it not being a refugee story, it helped me understand the fine line between refugee and migrant. Migration entails a return, like birds that move to warmer climates and return many times within the same year. Refuge, however, entails a finality of settlement elsewhere, altering the existing community by integrating new members. Fear of novelty is part of human nature, but it shouldn't be a factor in hindering others from enjoying the right to safety. Earlier this summer, when I read on the Olympic refugee team, the first team of its kind at the Olympics, was a Syrian swimmer named Yusra Mardini, who pushed a faulty boat with her sister for 3 hours to save 20 lives, I was in awe. I had a faint feeling of what my grandfather went through at 16, the fear, the waiting, the potential to lose one's life at sea, and then the story of a remarkable survival. When Mardini won the swimming heat in Rio, I stood in my living room staring at the TV as I cried. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yaroslava, do you want to come and join these terrific presentations remind us that issues we are facing in this country exist all around the world. And so as a first question we have from Natasha. Oh my gosh.
No, how do you know it's for me?
because I can't read the handwriting. That's how I know. Okay, so Khaled ended his presentation by saying that national borders are bound to disappear. The current trend everywhere is just the reverse. Build a wall, as Donald Trump says repeatedly. Any thoughts about that? And we can ask as many who can answer as they like. Yeah, but Khaled, start with you.
As I said, that the countries of North, the rich countries, has a real need to these immigrants. And they play a false role to say that they are against this immigration. And the reality is they are in need. And the statistics is extremely clear in this issue. This is for what? These countries will continue to have more and more of immigrants. For the idea of boundaries and nation state, in my opinion, as a political scientist, I think that we are living today in a transition period. The world built in 18th century, this idea of school and university and nation state and representative democracy, etc. This world built by ideas in 18th century died, is finished. And it's finished decades ago. And politicians continue to deny the death of the world of 18th century. And one of the aspects of this world is the nation state as we know now. These flags will disappear very soon. Not after hundreds of years, no, after some decades of now. And as I said in my text, that the immigration is a real activity in the history of human being from millions and millions of years ago, and it will continue. Thank you.
Others want to take that on?
I just have a quick comment. I'm not a political scientist or anything, but what I think happens in most cases when people say, I don't want anyone else to come from outside, is that they fear what the others from outside can bring, because we don't know what background these people come from, what is their expectations and how they function. But sometimes we tend to overlook the fact that the same harm we're scared of that can come from the outside can actually come from the inside, with people who have been living in this place for their entire lives, who do not come from the outside, because you cannot predict where danger comes from. And this is why there are calls for, like, build walls, lock people out, keep separate borders. Everyone has to stay in their own place. But I think it's a big debate that cannot be handled by one side or the other. So
I just want to add that it's always kind of curious to me, because as human beings or as nation states, we find it easy to move capital, to accept money from borders, from countries, but we don't find it difficult to accept the people from that country. And I'll also speak for Nigeria, because, for example, we have the Boko Haram issue, which is a very messy issue facing the country. Nigeria is divided along ethnic and most deeply religious lines. I always like to look at the reason why we reject the other. For Nigerians, you look at the ethnicity, you look at the religion. So, and when you look at the immigration crisis between Europe and Middle East Asia, you're looking at religion. Oh, he's Islam, and then there's this political description, the labeling of Islam. And then for Nigeria, you have, it's happening in the north. It's predominantly Muslim in the north, where I grew up, and in the southern part is predominantly Christian. So when there are conflict situations and people are coming from the north or from the south, you're looking at, he's the other, he's a Christian, or he's the other, he's a Muslim. And there is always a conflict, or kind of a power tussle between Christianity and Muslim. Who is the champion, who is the king of the world, So all these things come into place. But when it comes about, we talk about finances, we let that apart and we rush for the money. But when it comes for people, we begin to look at their luggages. Thank you.
Because we all appreciate very much the translation. We have here Tina from Ukraine. She can maybe translate from Yaroslava if Yaroslava wants to speak in Russian. And we have here Tina, professor in English literature in Ukraine, can be translated if you want. Yeah. Because Yaroslava, it will be easier for her to speak in Russian. And we have Tina. So, what do you think about that?
For sure, definitely, yeah.
I think Hodna cannot say something about that.
And as it happens, Yaroslava, we have a question just for you, so we'll need Tatiana.
Then we need another, maybe.
So the question for Yaroslava is, what makes you believe, as you said in your presentation, that this situation is only temporary? And what would it take, in your view, to have that change?
Nothing, I just threw. Ничего, потому что ничего не делается для того, чтобы это сделать.
Still nothing, because nothing is done yet about the situation, to fix the situation.
Просто я верю в лучшее.
I just believe in better in this life. So she's just being optimistic.
Well, that was a large production for a very short answer. But, so I'm going to give you a question from Peter with the hope that this will generate a larger answers. He wonders how each of you deal in your writings with the outsider, with those who would be immigrants or those who would be emigrating. And any writer can, yeah, Ukamaka, do you want to start?
For me, I deal with them as people. Because when you already have this idea, oh, he's a refugee, you begin to restrict the character from fully developing in your work. You begin to bog that character down with your expectation of what an immigrant or what the other is. But when you remove all those unnecessary labels and cement block, you see the character blossom. Even if you want to still tell an immigrant story, don't start that character as an immigrant, start him as, or him or her as a human being, and then just, I let the story flow. Thank you.
Usually for me, I try to relate what I know of my feelings towards a certain subject, but flip them to kind of also include the other person. So if I'm writing about a character who is, let's say, very different from me, I try not to relate to the difference, but I mostly try to relate to what might be similar to that character that I can emotionally get attached to and produce the work.
In my plays, the outsider is almost absent.
Хотя в последней пьесе отображен конфликт между Россией и Украиной.
Thus, in my last play, in current play, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is being depicted.
Когда добрые соседи по-соседски звали женщину сначала фашисткой за то, что она немка из русских немцев.
Because kind neighbors called one woman a fascist only because she was of German origin.
А потом стали звать фашисткой за то, что она носит украинскую фамилию мужа.
And then they started calling her fascist because she had the name, the last name, she took the last name of her husband. Ukrainian husband.
В России в свое время очень прогремела пьеса «Вербатим», которая называется «Война молдаван за картонную коробку».
In Russia, a play Verbatim became like a thunderstorm. Which was about the war of people of Moldova. For a carton box.
Это пьеса, документальная пьеса. На протяжении нескольких месяцев авторы ходили и собирали интервью у молдаван, которые живут и работают в России.
It is a documentary play which was created by journalists who picked the material for a long time.
И она имела, можно сказать, оглушительный успех.
It has an outstanding success in Russia.
Хотя успех здесь слово не подходит.
Although the success is not a good word for that.
Потому что многие люди не ожидали услышать то, что они услышали.
Because lots of people didn't expect actually to hear what they really heard.
For those in the audience who don't know, it's interesting that a Ukrainian writer is translating a Russian playwright so that we can understand what's going on. Yeah.
That's about the conflict of Russia and Ukraine.
Khaled?
For myself, I didn't understand very well the question, as the immigrants are as pieces in their own, as we have to deal with our race and our language and our culture, and as the others are so different. This idea is not at all related to reality, to the real world. Today, approximately 70% of the population of the planet is living in cities. And in cities, we can't find, except less than 15% of the population of almost all cities in the world has 4 decades behind them in the city. If we make any calculation of your friends, for example, and you ask about 4 decades behind anyone, and you will find all these people are coming. They are immigrants to this city. Then 85% of the people living in cities are immigrants, and 70% of the population of the planet today is living in cities, and it will be 85% very soon, and some of the people, some of the specialized in the cities speak today about 100% of this planet, of the planet live in cities. Then what I want to say that we are all immigrants, and we can't as writers write about someone who are living in a city from decades and from centuries, for example, or generations behind him. We are living in a world of immigrants, and we are writing, all of us, to immigrants and for immigrants.
A particular question for Alice, the writer wonders, what is life like in Palestine, and do you feel like a refugee in your own country?
Thank you. I'm often asked when I'm abroad what life is like in Palestine. It's the usual answer I immediately give out is that it's not easy. It's not one of the easiest places to be, because there are always issues about identity and about movement from one place to another, and restrictions to movement, restrictions to daily life, and it affects my writing, it affects my well-being. But I do not feel like a refugee. I sometimes feel more or less like a visitor because of the status of my identity, and because of how I deal with the world, and how I get to see things and experience things, whether they're dangerous, whether they're safe, whether they're joyous. So that experience of moving from one city to another on a daily basis and crossing different borders every single day makes it more for me the idea of like I'm just a visitor from the city to the other city. I'm not moving my entire self with me, because it's not easy to like put your life on the line every single day. Even when you're moving, anything can happen. But this is something I've learned to manage throughout the years, and it doesn't get easy, but you get used to it.
A slightly more complicated question here. The writer writes, from the 15th century to the middle of the 20th century, the West adopted militant migration as a strategy of survival, accommodation, and control. Slavery, colonialism, and post-colonial neoliberal interventions are examples of such programs. Is it true that the conditions that have been created around the world are a motivation for migration from the unstable, undeveloped world to the stable and developed world? Anyone can take that on.
I think Cardoso and the Brazilian economist spoke a lot about this division between North and South, and developed a very clear concept and theory about this movement between North and South. I have personally plenty of critiques on his on Cardoso works about the North and South, but for sure the relation North-South, it is extremely clear that any trial from the countries of the South to make a development, economical or political or social, was totally aggressed and by the supreme power at the moment, from British or French or United States and other big colonial powers in the last 200 years of colonialism. And that's for what not many, all countries of the South had a real problems to make any developments. In the text I read today, it was approximately 5,000 words, and I cut it to 700 words only. And I had approximately 2,000 words from this text. It was about 19 countries and the death by the colonialism of these leaders to try to make a real development in their countries. They all or killed or had a revolution against them, etc., in South America and Asia and Africa. And this is for what, when the South countries were stopped to make a real development, it was completely normal that we have this migration from the south to the north. But as I said, the migration, the immigration is much older than the colonialism and is much, much older than the period of time we are living in. We can't really see and understand immigration without seeing what happened in the last 1 million years.
Khaled, when we put this up online, can we get your larger argument as a part of that? Would you be willing to give us that? The longer piece that you wrote, would you be willing to let us put that up online so others who are interested? Sure. Yeah, so we will do that, yeah. Ukamaka?
Mr. Chris, could you just read the last part of the question, just the last part?
Okay.
Put it into perspective.
Well, it was this strategy of militant migration, did that create the motivation for people to move from the unstable, undeveloped world to the stable and developed world?
Okay, let me use Nigeria for example, or let me paint a picture this way. I often agree with my father's notion that the reason why the West was able to migrate easily to Africa, to create the borders and name countries, and because they had the instrument, they had the vehicles, they had the ships, they had technology, things that were able to make them move from farther away from their countries to the more complacent villages, cities, where people hadn't thought of building such massive, gigantic ships to be able to trade with the West. So when they came to our villages, they brought new things, shiny new things, guns, mirrors, things that were attractive to the usually complacent villagemen, and that was how they were able to move slaves from our place down to the West. Now for the present day, then it was more of seeking more, asking for more, just like the Torah, but you want to see more. You already have that technology, you're seeking for more, you're developing. But for the present stage, for Africans, it's more of instability. You are living because of, you are fleeing violence, you are fleeing because you are not comfortable, like one of the sad cases that happened 2 months ago, a Nigerian who lost his child during one of the Boko Haram attacks in northern Nigeria, fled with his wife to Italy. And then in Italy, he was attacked by a racist who made some funny comments, and it led to a fight, and the man was mobbed on the street and he died. So he fled Nigeria due to Boko Haram attack, and he died in Italy. So the notion of moving from Nigeria or from the south to the north, or from the north to the south, is because of instability. But the notion of moving from the west to Africa, to less developed places, is to pillage, is to take over, is to take dominion. So that's the conflict we usually have. Thank you.
Shabod has, as he says, a woman-centric question, as there are 3 women on the panel. Actually, 4 now. Do you think that women are doubly victimized when refugees move?
Take that question.
I'll take that. Yeah. Well, honestly, being a woman in a stable country is sometimes difficult on its own place. So imagine having to move from one place to another, or not just move, basically to be forced to move. And it plays a lot. I think I haven't been in this situation, so I can't judge for myself. But I think thinking of myself as a woman and thinking of women in general, it's a difficult process of moving, uprooting. The woman has a responsibility naturally to be the safe haven for the family and be the one who collects and gathers everyone and the children and the husband. So it becomes a difficult process for her to make the cross, to ask for stability once again in a normal place. That sometimes when you're separated from your loved ones or in the whole process can lead to sometimes to victimization at times, of course, but it might be the process itself, or it might be just the circumstances around them. We can't, I think, pinpoint exactly what happens because each case is different and each woman would deal with the circumstances around her differently, I think.
Okay, I'll just add a short comment. It's already difficult being a woman. You know, you give birth to a child, and it's like when I gave birth to my son, I asked the doctor, so what did I give birth to? And he said, oh, you gave birth to a long thing. You know, a long thing, being the penis. You gave birth to a penis, you gave birth to a man. So the responsibility was lesser, but you gave birth to a girl. The responsibility already as a child, it's like a curse. The child is already burdened with expectation, social expectation. You have to sit this way, you have to do this way, you have to become this way. So it's already difficult being a woman. And then for people like my part of the country where you're expected to get married early, I got married at the age of 19. So even at the age of 16, you're expected to get married, and then you're not married. Oh, you're finally married. Do you have children? So if you are unlucky to be in a place of conflict, you are taken advantage of. You have cases of trafficking. Yeah, it's very sad, personal case, but then you have cases of trafficking, sexual trafficking, taking people from one point to the other because they are fleeing violence, they are fleeing home due to conflicts. But for a man, it's easy. He can walk, he can hang out, he can even sleep in uncompleted buildings. But for a woman, it's difficult. You have to protect yourself from the society, you have to protect yourself from being raped, you have to protect yourself from being trafficked. It's enormous. So it's much more difficult for the woman because, number one, you are a woman. That's being difficult. And then number two, you have to protect yourself. So if a man protects himself just 100%, you have to go 1,000% because you have a lot to lose.
I think it all depends on the situation, on a particular situation. I know a lot of young women who came from different countries, both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but they came without their families, so not been married. So they entered the universities, they got married successfully and became a part of Russian society. From the other side, I observe a big amount of women who are not young anymore, dressed in their national clothes, who have low-paid jobs. And it's very clear that these women came with their families, they are under pressure of their families, and who will never be able to change anything, to break these ties. So it's about lots of factors, actually.
Ode wonders, how much do dictatorships or religious fanatical movements, what part do they play in sending people on the road? For anybody to answer.
First of all, I can't say that the Islamist movement in the Arab world are really disencourage people to immigrate, because from very early, in the beginning of 50s, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt had a bureau, a very active bureau in Switzerland. And the grandson of the guy who went in Switzerland became today a big star in television in Switzerland and in France. His name is Tariq Ramadan. And this big star, he is the grandson of the husband of the daughter of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then just after, in also the 50s, the Muslim Brotherhood sent a very active bureau in West of America and in the East of America. And they were very much involved in the United States, Canada, and many countries in Europe to build mosques and to speak about the importance to be related to the, between brackets, Islamic identity. Many Egyptians I know, and many Arab I know, they traveled abroad with very open mind and their relation with the world. And they become to these countries, between brackets, North countries, with the relation with South North, and they became fanatic. I know many Arabs that came in the United States totally tolerant, and they became here in the United States extremely fanatic by the works of the Muslim Brotherhood and others, extreme fanatic movements in Islamism. Then it's not at all true that these movements try to stop people to immigrate. And the same for the Church of Egypt, the Coptic Church of Egypt. It's an Orthodox church. They have also an important branch in United States. United States, it's a very conservative country and a religious country generally. Naturally, I don't like at all to make such a generalization. It's very mistaken from me. But if I may, I can say that this country, it's generally were a conservative country in the last 50 years. And this for what? They had also this relationship with the conservative powers in the, between brackets, South countries. And for the dictators, they are dictators, but at the same moment, they are dictators with a very, very good relations with the governments of the North. I even can say, with a fiction point of view, they are servants of the governments of the North. In Egypt, Sadat, for example, and Mubarak after him, were totally related to the European and American orders, and totally related to the World Bank idea of development and economy, for example. And then, actually, the conservative powers and the dictators, both of them have the same coin, but they have the two parts, sorry? Two faces of the same coin. Then, in a matter of fact, we cannot at all understand neither the dictatorship or the very conservative movements without understanding that they are both the same coin exactly. We as cultural people, we are totally under the surface of life. We are totally forbidden to make real activities. And this idea, this very false idea that the dictators are against the Muslim Brotherhood or against the Islamists, it's not true. Yes, some of them are in prisons, but we can't, for example, I saw myself in the 1970s, the propaganda made by the Sadat, the president, and made by the money of the North. And this propaganda said, join the troops to make the war against the Red Devil. And the Red Devil was naturally Russia and Soviet Union, and it was to go to war to Afghanistan. It was in every street in all Egypt, in villages and in the cities. This propaganda, it was made by the Egyptian government, and it is totally related to the religious idea of making a war against the atheists. And the atheist, naturally, was the Soviet Union at that time. Then it is not. It is very much complicated than your question.
Let me speak for Nigeria. I will only speak for the way I know. I wouldn't say the Islamic bodies intentionally cause people to move or force people to migrate or to leave. For Nigeria, in the 80s, we had the Metasine movement, just like we have Boko Haram of today. For Metasine, which mostly the activity started in Kano State, where I was born, where my parents lived, they hated anything westernization, just like Boko Haram hated Western education. So what they did was to anything that has to do with westernization, wristwatches, bicycles, they destroyed it. They don't want anything Western associated to infiltrate their communities. So, but what it led to was conflict between them and the police, between them and the government. And in a day in 1980, early 80s, before I was born, it led to one of the grievous conflicts in Kano State that even within days, over 2,000 people died. So, but the government, what they did now was to clamp down on the activities of Metasine, and they fled to the neighboring states from Kaduna to old Gongola states, and finally we didn't hear of Metasine, but decades later Boko Haram started. So for the Islamic bodies, they do not intentionally cause people to leave, but it's the conflict that comes from the clash between them and the government, the clash between them and the police that gives birth to terrorism, because when the police clamps down on them, they go back and they come back stronger to clamp down, to fight back on the government. And then they have arms, they have weapons, and that's why we have terrorism of today. So they do not intentionally make people to leave, but the conflict that came with rejecting westernization caused people to leave, because you wouldn't stay in a place where bombing occurs and you have your children. Yes, so for dictatorship, as you said, for my place, you have gagging of press, lack of freedom to speak, to write for journalists and elder writers. Even many of our writers in the 80s, 90s, they fled Nigeria because of the dictatorship. They fled to comfortable places where they will be able to write as they want to. So I hope that responds to your question. Thank you.
And I'm afraid that we have gone way over time. So before I ask the writers to leave us with one last question, we were asked, one writer said, you've been, Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner was mentioned. They'd like each of you to give one book on this subject, okay, to pass out to the audience. But before we go, I want to tell you about some upcoming events. 5 o'clock this afternoon, we'll have writers from India and the Philippines reading in the Shamba House, where we'll serve more carbohydrates in the form of bagels. Sunday will be at Prairie Lights at 4 o'clock. Next Wednesday, we have a special presentation of the project Manifestation Pro /Con Dada organized by IWP alum from Romania. And next Wednesday night we have Cinematheque, and finally back here again next Friday to hear writers talk about fiction in the age of film. So just quickly, one book for the audience to hear. Khaled?
Start Khaled.
Yeah.
We'll start from Khaled.
One book. Alice, ready?
So basically, we need to name one book on the subject.
One book that you would recommend, yeah.
Oh, in general, okay. Currently, I'm reading Palestinian poet Natalie Hamdal. One of her books is called The Lives of Rain. It is not strictly about refugees again, but it's a poetry book that deals with the idea of moving spaces and carrying things with you across. So it's the first book that sprang to my mind, and feel free to check it out.
Okay, I would recommend Nigeria's Elnathan John, Born on a Tuesday. It's a story of a young boy. If you want to understand how Boko Haram recruit their youth, the young ones, how young people get, like I say, interested in fighting for various causes because of misconception of what the whole idea is about. You would read Elnathan John's Born on a Tuesday, Elnathan John, Born on a Tuesday. Yeah. Thank you.
Yaroslava?
Это может быть, например, пьеса, про которую я говорила.
It can be a play which I was talking about.
И есть пьеса такая драматурга Анны Батуриной.
And there is a play of a
Анна Батурина.
of Anna Baturina.
Называется «Кафе Шарун».
It is called Cafe Sharun.
Да. Ну, я больше по драматургии, поэтому, наверное, про книгу я скажу.
So I'm more an expert in drama, so well, it's really hard for me to recommend something like a regular book.
Then we'll turn to Khaled to close it up.
I recommend Al-Harafish. It is translated into English with the same name. They didn't change the name. Al-Harafish, E-L-H-A-R-A-F-I-S-H. Al-Harafish. Of Naguib Mahfouz. Naguib, N-A-G-U-I-B, Mahfouz, M-A-H-F-O-U-Z.
And as
It's a very beautiful novel.
And as you can see, there's always much more to talk about than we have time for, but we have many more panels to continue this conversation. I look forward to seeing you at some of our other events. Thank you all.